act of faith. I've known Rita for several years now through that connection to Yale Divinity School. And before she was at Harvard, she was an associate at Trinity Church in Copley Square. And before that, she spent some time both living with the monastic community in Taizé, France, and serving as a youth minister in the Diocese of South Dakota. So I know she's going to share with us some of what she learned in that context, and we're excited to hear from you. Rita, and your dog too.
Yeah.
So I'll turn it over to you, and
thank you,
and welcome again.
Well, thank you. So I thought what I would do, I'm curious, I'll be curious to know as we go along what your questions are. So kind of store them up. I thought I would just share a little bit of the story of what happened to me in South Dakota when I served there. And I got to work with the Lakota Episcopal community, as well as the non-Lakota Episcopal community, and a number of young adults, and kind of watch something amazing come into being. So I thought I would just share a little bit of that story, show a couple of pictures, but please, feel free to raise your hand as I go if I'm skimming over something that you want to hear more about, or something that I'm sort of taking for granted. For those of you who I can see now, would you give me a show of hands how familiar you are, if anyone has a connection with South Dakota? Like, has anyone spent some time there? Okay, that's good to know. Nice. Okay, and does anyone have a connection with or familiarity with the Taizé community? Okay. All right, good. So that's helpful to know. So what I should walk us into. So what I'll do is I'll start by just telling you a little bit of my story. So as Ryan said, I went to Yale Divinity School, and after that I came to your neck of the woods. So I was at St. Mark's in New Canaan, was my first call after seminary, and I was a youth minister there. And that pardon me, my dog is seeing ducks outside and is very excited. So that was my first encounter with youth ministry. And what I learned at St. Mark's in New Canaan is I learned that young adults and teenagers in church are a very, very, very particular and powerful kind of witness to the gospel. Both because they have the ability to be flexible with their identity, but also because their hearts are very much on fire and very present. So they're very interesting people to work with in church. And I didn't know that before I came to St. Mark's in New Canaan. And that's also where I encountered Taizé. So the young adults in New Canaan already had a practice of going to Taizé once a year, which is this ecumenical monastic community in rural France. And I went and I saw something amazing. So this is a monastic community that hosts thousands of young people every week, from Easter all the way through All Saints. And I had never heard of such a thing. And when I asked the teenagers why they went every year, their answer was amazingly consistent. And they said they went for the silence, because the style of prayer in Taizé is to have 3 prayers a day. And in the middle of it, there is a 8 to 10 minute chunk of silence. And I was very surprised to discover that a group of teenagers demanded that their parents send them to France once a year so that they could be silent multiple times a day. I thought, oh, this is very interesting. But the other big thing I learned in taking these young people to Taizé was the power of an experience of church which is integrated into the rest of their lives. So in the course of a day in the monastic community of Taizé, the meals, the prayers, the Bible study, and the fellowship all began to refer and relate to one another, so that it became very easy to see something which we can say easily intellectually, but can't always feel, which is that the gospel is a way of life. It's not a set of religious ideas or commitments, so much as it is a way of being together, and a way of being together in love. So this was very interesting. So I became very interested in how Taizé was a way that the church, ideas in church, could really be felt and experienced. And Taizé, in the time that I went there, began to a part of its life began to even grow more, which is they host people in France, but they also visit people all over the world. So when people come to visit them, the young people that come to visit from all over the world make friends with the brothers, and the brothers make friends with them. And there's this amazing sense that if people will go to visit them, they ought to visit people back. And I had never heard of this. I had never heard of religious leaders, first of all, operating on the terms of friendship as the primary infrastructure, and also that a religious leader, a monk, a serious person, would go to Brazil or Rwanda or India to visit a young person who wanted some encouragement building up something in their own community. I thought this was kind of amazing to behold. And specifically, it turns out, Taizé spent a lot of time in places that were really troubled. So one of their really famous ones in this regard, they held a meeting of several days with this kind of life of shared prayer together in Rwanda. So if you can imagine bringing people together after the kind of genocidal conflict in Rwanda to come together and sit together and pray and share meals and reflections and fellowship, that is something very amazing. And so this also is very interesting to me. Again, in my mind, I would think about things like reconciliation or addressing serious conflict. And I might think about how to come to the table. We use that expression, and maybe draw up an agreement so we could agree that we could find a way to meet one another. Whereas Taizé had this idea and has this idea that maybe you could if you could literally come and sit together next to one another, that you would have found common ground, literally, by being together. And that maybe by sharing some life together, you would be able to find a way of discovering a kind of union that was maybe even bigger than the things which were very big things that were keeping you apart. So this is a very interesting model. So all of this is in my mind, and I began to be good friends with the brothers at Taizé, and I really loved this model, and I thought a lot about how this model could live in our church. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but when I've seen Taizé make its way across to the United States, generally speaking, it's associated with this style of singing and prayer. So a repetitive chant and some time of silence and dim lighting and icons and things like this. It's part of our contemplative prayer tradition at this point. But I noticed that what was most powerful in Taizé was actually the life together, which held these prayers and which these prayers were the anchor and backbone of. But it wasn't simply a style of worship. So I was thinking about this. All right, so then I got invited to go back to South Dakota. When I was in seminary, I did an internship in South Dakota and fell in love with it. I worked on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. And what I found was really astonishing for me. I'm a lifelong New Englander. And so there were parts of the life and pattern in South Dakota that were very difficult for me, namely that you're not really supposed to talk very much. This was very hard for me, but it was a very good discipline. But it's a very, very different kind of cultural energy in South Dakota from the Northeast. And I was really gripped by it. So the landscape, for those of you who've been there, you know this, the landscape is so big. It's just so big and so vast that it's very easy to be a religious person there. So I felt sometimes in the Northeast like I would have to make a case to people that God was real. But boy, in the middle of the Great Plains, you do not have to convince anyone that God is real, because the very magnitude of the land is so powerful and overwhelming that you can't help but feel your own place, you're put into your own place, as it were. And I noticed something on the Rosebud Indian Reservation I was aware of, and I encountered what we can only describe with the terms of extreme poverty and all the attendant symptoms of what that does to a culture. But what I was most struck by was that even with those challenges, here was a culture, this current contemporary Lakota culture, that was committed to being its own culture, somehow very distinct from the rest of America. I thought that was very interesting. So there's a kind of cultural tenacity that I found amazing. And you could see that with this generations of grief and trauma affecting the community from the history that it suffered over the last 100 years, that young people in South Dakota young Lakota people are faced with a very, very, very serious and difficult challenge. So there's a kind of a gap in continuity of teaching. So if we can imagine people's great-great-grandparents, maybe one generation behind that, had a kind of lifestyle that we might associate with, old drawings or something, with people living close to the land with the buffalo and with the Lakota language and their old ways. And that tradition really got interrupted significantly by the course of history, both the reservations and sadly much of the church, cutting out the language, cutting out the traditional ways, and really the entire culture having to suffer through that, sort of losing a generation or two to grief. And now a young generation having to figure out in this modern age how to authentically be the next version of Lakota culture. Oh, that is incredible. That's an incredible task, and an incredible task for a group of young people who do not have the sort of resources and tools that we might say you would need if you were going to tackle such a weighty problem. So I became very interested in South Dakota. I spent all this time, as I just said, in Taizé with young people. And then I went back to South Dakota at their request. So the Diocese of South Dakota has two things that you need to know about. There's the diocese that we might recognize as the predominantly white diocese in the cities and towns. And then there's the deanery, which is not a deanery of geography, but ethnicity, called the Niobrara Deanery. And this is the association of all the reservation churches, as well as the Native communities in the big cities of Rapid City and Sioux Falls. So you have in the diocese, you have the Niobrara Deanery, which is the association of all the Lakota Episcopal churches. And then you have the wider diocese. And the one place that these two groups come together is out in the Black Hills, which, if you know your Indian history, your American history, you know that the Black Hills is the single most contested piece of land for the Lakota. And the Black Hills are the equivalent in biblical terms. It's the Jerusalem. It's the Jerusalem for the Lakota, the land which is sacred, the land which was given to the people to care for by God and taken by the federal government, despite the Fort Laramie Treaty, which promised the land to the Lakota. So this is a problem. Well, the Episcopal Church happens to have camp in the Black Hills. And so in this camp in the Black Hills, Thunderhead Episcopal Center is one of the only places in the diocese where Native and non-Native people come together. And this is a very interesting place for the Episcopal Church. Now, I'm going to say one more thing about the Episcopal Church in South Dakota, and then I'll pick up the pace a little bit. But all of this background is a part of good Lakota storytelling, which is just not rushed, and B, which the context does become significant in both cases for these two worlds to kind of collide and meet. But the Episcopal Church in South Dakota has a bit of a history that is worth being proud of. So I'm happy to be able to share it with you. You may know of the history of boarding schools across reservations in the country, run by both Catholics and Episcopalians. And they were horrible. They were abusive and horrible. And they had the theory that you should kill the Indian and save the man. And in the Catholic boarding schools, all Lakota was forbidden completely. But in the Episcopal boarding schools, something interesting happened, which is that the only place Lakota was permitted was in church. So the Bible, the prayer book, and the hymnal were all translated into Lakota, and that was where Lakota lived. Now that's a very interesting move, because it means that the language of faith is the language of the people. And to this day, Lakota as a spoken language is in grave danger of dying, but the liturgical language of Lakota is still alive and well. So that's an interesting detail. The other two parts of the story that I'd like to share are, so I was ordained by Bishop Creighton Robertson. I was ordained in South Dakota. And he tells a story about when his grandfather met the first missionaries. And the first missionaries came and they all sat down in a circle in the teepee with the fire in the middle and kind of heard the story from the missionaries, heard the story of Jesus. And that after this storytelling, there was a long period of silence. which the Lakota elders took in the story. And then, as Bishop Creighton would tell it, his grandfather said, well, we've known about God the Creator, and we've known about the Holy Spirit, but we're very interested to learn that he has had a son. So thank you for telling us about this. Now that is very interesting because, again, for me, growing up in the Northeast, I was taught that if something like Christianity went to a place like South Dakota, it could only ever be in this oppressive colonialist kind of way. So it's very interesting to me to hear that the native way of telling the story of Christianity was different than what I had expected. And that in fact, there was a very authentic way in which the spirituality of the Lakota culture had space to take in Christianity fairly effortlessly. And as, of course, this sort of experience of persecution and oppression continued, well, as you know, our Bible is very strong on that storyline. So for a people wondering how it is that they could be exiled from their own land, the Bible and the story of the Israelites is very powerful. So this was also two different ways in which it was strange to see my religious tradition suddenly take on a totally new meaning in this context. And then the last thing is this Father Hinman. This is also very significant. So you may have heard the story of the Dakota 38. It's an awful story. It's happened, a group of Nakota, a band of Nakota in the southeast part of what is South Dakota now. They were mistreated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who wasn't giving them any food rations, so they were starved. And they took over the storehouse and they took the food that was promised to them by the government. Well, Abraham Lincoln, not his finest moment, ordered the entire tribe to be put to death. 300 people, 300 plus people, he ordered to mass execution for doing what they needed to do to survive. Well, there was this Episcopal priest, Father Hinman, who lived with them at the time, who made the arduous journey from South Dakota back to Washington, D.C., which in 1862 is no small feat, and pleaded with the president. So the president pardoned most of the tribe. He ended up hanging 38 Native people in Mankato, Minnesota, the Dakota 38, which is still the largest mass execution in our country's history. But because of the fact that this Episcopal priest lived with this tribe and really worked hard to save them, that's a part of the legacy of the Episcopal Church that is remembered to this day. Okay, so now you've got a lovely landscape. You've got Taizé over here, praying 3 times a day, going global, silence in the middle of it. And you've got this Lakota Episcopal Church, Lakota and non-Episcopal Church here in South Dakota. And now the storyline comes that how do these two things go together? And so when I went there in 2007, I was called there by this Niobrara deanery, and I was called there because of the epidemic rates of youth suicide. So that's a pretty daunting thing to be called into. The question was, does the church have anything to offer here? And as I've already said, there's this incredible mixture of poverty and despair, as you can see by something like, high rates of suicide, as well as this incredibly large cultural project laid on the shoulders of Lakota young people. So I thought a lot about, what could the church offer here? So I thought a lot about this camp that I mentioned out in the Black Hills, this very sacred place. And what we began to do was we began to try to live at the camp as though, when we were there in the summer, as though we were in a place like Taizé. So we tried to make ourselves less of a kind of church camp on its own and more of a kind of project of community life held by prayer with one another, to which each group of campers would come and go, but that the staff, the young adults who worked there would kind of hold this community in the same way that the brothers held the community at Taizé. And it turns out that the style of prayer of Taizé makes a lot of sense in the South Dakota cultural frame because of this big chunk of silence, where sometimes in a place like here, Boston or something, a huge chunk of silence is kind of uncomfortable. But in South Dakota, it made tons of sense. So we began to pray in this way. And we began to try to live together, and we began to try to live intentionally in this way of honoring the fact that here was a place where white and Lakota people were able to come together. And this is exactly what I was saying in terms of the Taizé model of reconciliation. Maybe if we don't go right at the things we know will divide us immediately, but maybe if we could live together and we could discover some common songs and prayer together, maybe that would be a kind of a beginning of possibility. And indeed it was. So we took a group of South Dakota young adults to Taizé in one of those first years. And two of the people that went with us were Tyrone and Tyson White, two brothers from the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. And when we got to Taizé, we had an amazing time. And to the brothers' knowledge, those were the first Native Americans that they had welcomed to Taizé. And this was very interesting for them. And so, as I told you, they had this amazing response where Brother Alois, the prior of Taizé, met these two brothers and invited them to dinner with the rest of the monks, which is quite an honor and a privilege, and said to them this very beautiful sentence: "You've come such a long way to visit us, perhaps we should come to visit you." So over the next several years, this friendship blossomed between Native young adults, actually from around the country, as well as in South Dakota, and white people from South Dakota would go over to France and kind of get a different look back on South Dakota. So the problems and circumstances of South Dakota suddenly get put into context by experience with global community, as well as just finding an extreme amount of solidarity with other young people trying to build the church in some way. And so this friendship grew, and there were internships, there were young people who spent summers and came back and forth, there were prayers that sprung up all over the state. And we began to imagine holding a kind of this experience of living some days together on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And so that is what happened. So I'm going to show you a few pictures now, and I'm going to put a link or two in the chat so that you can see some of this. Some pictures of what this ended up looking like. But wait, before I do that, let me actually just put the links in, might be easier. You can look at them at your leisure. So the first thing is just an article from the Episcopal News Service, which tells kind of the story of the meeting. You've heard now the sort of the backstory of these cultures meeting, but here's the link to this story from the Episcopal News Service if you would like to look. And then there is also an open Facebook page which has pictures of this eventual meeting. And I see that it's taken so long to tell you the background of the story that I've probably even told you enough, but let me just show you this one lovely picture here. Okay, so hold on. Thank you for your patience. All right. Okay, can everyone see that? So what transpired at the end of several years of this meeting and praying together, the Two Bulls family, several generations of Lakota Episcopal priests who have a little church right up above the picture is being taken from where the church is, right up over, looking out over all of the Badlands. And we were able to host over 500 people from all over the country to come and spend some days together in this way of living together that Taizé had brought to our mind, and that made tons of sense in this context where we prayed outside here in the Badlands, and we camped up above and had the tribe, the Oglala Lakota tribe, donated 2 buffalo for the meeting. So we ate buffalo together, and we sang and we prayed, and we had some days together of imagining some new possibilities forward. And that was, so that's the end. That was a long story, everybody. So there's the links. This picture is in one of those. And thank you so much for listening to that long story. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. So tell me, what are people's questions?
Is this a recurring thing now, or did this happen just once? The fact that they had the Taizé-like encounter in South Dakota.
Yeah, well, that particular meeting was a kind of one-time event. The way that the Taizé community likes to to talk about these meetings. They're called stops on a pilgrimage of trust. And so the idea is that a meeting like this can function as a kind of sign. So it's a moment where people can see a possibility, but it's not a magic formula or anything like that. And, so different kinds of friendships and relationships came out of that and grew from it. But the meeting itself was something that happened once. Yeah.
What year were the Badlands taken by the government?
I wouldn't want to, I'd have to look it up because there were in the middle of
50 or more?
In the middle of the 1800s.
Middle of the 1800s, okay.
Back and forth, yeah.
And who's paying now to support these students going to, is that the Episcopal Church that's paying for these students?
Yes, the Episcopal Church in South Dakota tries its best to fundraise for young people to go to this camp, and to the extent that the relationship with Taizé continues, yeah, it's the diocese.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Bill here. I noticed in your biography that you have an athletic background, and I just wondered, in youth activities, and particularly with the Dakota or Lakota youth, did your activities involve getting them around the baseball diamond and playing sports, or was that really not part of the ministry?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. So it was a huge part of my experience in New Canaan, actually. I don't know if any of you are connected at all with St. Mark's, or if you knew Father Bird. He was there, Father Michael Bird was there before I was. And he gave me this great advice, which I've remembered ever since, which is, whenever it's possible, if you can coach a local team, you have a really significant way to be part of a town and a community. So at St. Mark's, I coached the high school cross-country program and the track program as well. And so it was a huge part of my experience with Taizé, for example. I had many athletes that would come with me on these trips, and we would do a lot of running together. In South Dakota, what I ended up doing was, I'm also a yoga teacher, and I ended up doing a lot of yoga as part of kind of facilitating these contemplative spaces, which I came to think would be the most useful thing the church could offer people facing all kinds of trauma and difficulty. Is just some calm, clear, spiritually focused space. So that was the main physical practice that was part of my ministry in South Dakota. But that's a great question. Thank you. What else is on your mind? Thoughts?
So Rita, I have a question.
Yeah.
How does this continue to inform your ministry now, or what are you learning or sharing with the community at Harvard?
That's a great question. So I would say, from that perspective, one of the things that was amazing to me about this whole experience in South Dakota was watching something really unfold organically over the course of, it was about 7 years from the sort of beginning of the story to this sort of culmination of a sort. It was a culmination for my time there, certainly, of this meeting on Pine Ridge. And this mixture of feeling like it was possible to sort of watch God doing something through these young people, and that my function was really to just sort of attend to that and to see where there was support or encouragement or guidance needed to sort of let something unfold. That was really powerful to see that was real and that could really produce something. And so now in my ministry at Harvard, I've taken that lesson on, which is to be working with a number of young adults and to see if I can just sort of watch and see what they're seeing and see what can be supported through there and what we can imagine. So it's funny, in terms of aesthetics, the big project we're working on at the chaplaincy now is, we started last year with the idea of creating a worship space that felt like our own. So we work with Christ Church Cambridge, and we're a small community, and we meet in this big church, and we're meeting at night, and the aesthetics of the church, where the way that we were experiencing it, were not stimulating us. So we decided to sort of imagine building something in the church. And then, so we got two Harvard School of Design students who were interested in sacred architecture. And they began to imagine a kind of tent that we might set up and take down inside the church. And so we got a grant and we began to try to make it a serious object, a design object, something that really felt somehow sacred and real to us. And then COVID happened. And so suddenly working on building a tent for an elaborately designed tent was suddenly became really important. So it was another moment of feeling like sort of watching these students create something and then just suddenly having it become something bigger. So currently we have this, it's not even really a tent, it's more like a structure, but thinking about South Dakota, it's these three wooden triangles on a platform, and we have church outside, like, nobody can go in the buildings. And so that's been a very interesting experience to see what that looks like. And it feels a little bit like that same pattern of just sort of finding a way to let God do the things that God can do through the young people that I've had the privilege to work with. Other questions, thoughts?
Are there any Lakota at Harvard?
Not that I am aware of. That does not mean that they are not, but I have not yet encountered. And the presence of one of the things and I've just started there, so I'm only in my second year, and of course it's a very strange year to have started anywhere, really. I'm looking at you, Father Ryan. It's a strange year to start things. But yeah, I'm curious to know, to learn more about the kind of Native presence in the Cambridge area. So we're sort of looking to figure that out in the next year. Lovely.
I guess I have another question. Thank you for the other answer. I really appreciate that. How would you describe the health and vitality of Episcopal sort of ministry among Native peoples and sort of commitment on diocesan and national levels? And do you see that on a trajectory one way or the other, or what's your sense of that future?
That's a very interesting question. One of the things that I really loved seeing in the Diocese of South Dakota that felt like a strange way in which South Dakota is maybe ahead of us in some ways, ahead of the churches in our Massachusetts, Connecticut context, in that because of the geographic challenges, just people being so spread out, you have across the reservations in particular, I'm thinking, you have these kind of small community churches that are really kind of like chapels, and they're so spread out that it's just not possible to even imagine, and it hasn't been for a long time, to imagine the kind of parish model with a full-time priest. So for a long time, what has happened is that a priest would be kind of the convener or the servant of a consortium of churches across a large geographical region. And what that has meant is that in every one of those communities, there has needed to be real, robust, well-trained, authorized, developed lay leadership. So they developed this model of the senior catechist. And so almost every one of these churches has a senior catechist. And that person is something like a combination of a senior warden and the primary pastor, the liturgical leader who could preach and lead, morning prayer or an evening prayer, and really the person on the ground to be the kind of gathering leadership energy for the church in a region. And then the priest, the priest is also has of course this role and is able to be connected on a Sunday to get to as many as possible. But this idea of really empowering lay leadership in a significant way, and in a way that has both liturgical and formal qualities to it, this seemed very interesting to me as a kind of something that the larger church may wish to attend to in some way. In terms of the native presence of the Native Episcopal Church, one of the things about the Pine Ridge meeting is that the Office of Indigenous Ministries very generously gave a huge grant so that we could have the big tent for the event where all the meals and the kind of big gathering meetings up top with speakers and things could happen. And as I mentioned, the trips to Taizé ended up drawing from young adult representatives from around the Native Episcopal Church. So in mostly still the North Minnesota and Idaho and North Dakota, more so than the Southwest. So I think, as you know, that there are so many different tribes, and the connection of different tribes with the Episcopal Church varies regionally. So I'm not totally sure or confident as far as what to say in terms of a kind of witness of Native Episcopal spiritual vision or something like this, but certainly this kind of the model of thinking about really seriously thinking about how churches could be led by empowered laity, that seems pretty interesting to me.
Thanks. That's awesome. Are there other questions for Rita? If you have one, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey, Rita. I just want to know whether you're still running miles and miles and miles.
Well, I did. My husband and I started training for a half Ironman triathlon this March 1st. So right before COVID hit. And I have to say that having a giant endurance sport project in a time of being totally stuck in your house turned out to be a really great idea. Of course, our event got canceled, but we put it on. We made it up. So we live near Walden Pond, and we did the half iron triathlon from Walden Pond, and yeah, it was a great way to get through the last 6 months.
That's fantastic. That's
yeah.
fantastic.
What about you?
Did you beat him?
No.
No, I mean, occasionally out there, but mostly not. I'm interested to hear that you're now a yoga instructor, because that's sort of been a recent finding in this house. So
oh, nice.
Yeah, it's great.
Lovely.
Yeah,
Great.
that's great.
Rita, just a historic footnote, because you got a lot of Yale Divinity School people here. David Brainerd at Yale Divinity School was a great missionary to Native Americans.
Oh.
Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. And I think Yale Divinity School should probably have a whole lot more Native Americans going there, right?
Well, that's true. And I think actually, so since I was there, I'm a pretty dedicated alum. And so since I've been in South Dakota, I've almost continuously, there's been at least one young adult there at the Div School from South Dakota, which is new from my time, starting with Portia Herney, who I think Ryan might know. And so Ross Miller is there currently, and I believe Yale Divinity School actually has a specific kind of sub-interest area in Native ministry. So thank you for pointing that out. And yeah, it's a very interesting world.
And just on a more serious note, how like in our whole sort of world where we're now trying to talk about and like decenter whiteness, right? Like where does the Native population, and how does one become an ally, if you will, to those peoples and to that struggle?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm afraid my answer may not be overly popular. One of the things that I really learned pretty intensely in my time there was a sense of the way in which the word that we throw around as justice is simply not possible, simply not something within our power to grasp. And you just think about it in the simple terms of, okay, well, here's a culture whose way of life is simply demolished. There is no, you can't, there's no undoing that. There's no fixing that. There's no ameliorating that. There's not even any clear way forward. And I think in my context here in the Northeast, I've really been taught to kind of look for hope and look for solutions and see what we can do. And how can we? And in South Dakota, the energy was more to say, you can't. And that was really sobering. And I feel I really learned a lot from sitting with that. And I learned a lot in watching different levels. So I was there in total for a course of 10 years. I was still a total newcomer. And we know this in our parishes. This is like this too, right? I mean, it's beautiful. We're filled with communities with deep richness of time and commitment, such that to be part of something, you can be new, and you can also have people who are there for 40 years and still feel new. And South Dakota moves at a different pace. So that is just to say that I don't think there is a simple way to kind of discover a kind of solidarity. Again, with this Taizé model, I found that the idea of pilgrimage feels really important. So while you can't necessarily develop deep and real relationships with a place that you're going to visit or know in small amounts of time, you could learn from by means of something like a pilgrimage. But then also too, that this idea of life together is really the only maybe believable way to discover solidarity. So for example, if you remember the whole thing with the Standing Rock pipeline a few years ago, and here came lots and lots of people, lots of well-meaning clergy like ourselves, wearing stoles and being proud to be in this camp for a week or two, but not really able to sort of live with or really deeply share the struggles of. So I think there's a way in which the lesson for me has been to be honest about what the actual limitations are of that solidarity or of that allyship, and to have the trust in God to sit with a big chasm without necessarily trying to cross it, but rather to say, whoa, this is a much bigger chasm than I thought. And of course, again, everything getting enacted spatially, the picture I showed you, this prayer in Pine Ridge, we literally sat in front of a giant chasm where we couldn't even begin to traverse it. So maybe that's an image that has really stuck with me.
Well, that's really helpful in this particular course that Naomi Cunningham and I actually together in the Sacred Conversations to End Racism, they talk about having to be in Saturday. Holy Saturday. We want so quickly to get to, to move from Good Friday to Sunday, but we have to just be in Saturday.
Yes. Actually, that's let me recommend a book. Maybe you've already seen this, but it brings these things together. It's a book called Life on the Edge, and it's by Brother John from Taizé. And it's written after his time with South Dakota, among other things. But the whole book is an exploration of Holy Saturday. And it's a great book. So,
sorry, its title again was?
Life on the Edge.
Thank you.
Brother John?
By Brother John, yeah. It's a great book for both being real about this kind of thing, but also understanding where the Christian hope is in such a sitting. Yeah.
Rita, thank you. This has been rich time. We're so grateful for you being with us and sharing your stories and your rich stories and your perspective. And I know we've all learned a lot and been inspired. So.
Oh, well, thank you. And I can't wait till I get to be there in person someday and hang out with you.
That would be nice.
Your way around. Great to have you.
Great.
Be well.
See you around.
Thanks, all. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Rita, do you know Megan Holding?
I do, yes.
Daughter-in-law.
Oh, no way. Of course, I guess I'm seeing it now, but I didn't. Yes. Oh, that's so wonderful. Yes.
I hope you're connecting up there.
Absolutely, because we're part of the chaplains. We're the chaplain crew. Yeah. So
Okay.
oh, that's great. I'll tell her I saw you.
Good.
All right. Thank you. See you later.